Going live now.
Very good.
Hello, my friends. It's Ranger Russ from the Meigs Nature Center. We're very excited today to bring the first of our wildlife series. And we're going to be doing these series on Saturdays at 10 o'clock through the month of February. So we've got several programs coming up. We're going to be doing a program on deer and their relationship to ticks in Connecticut. We've got bald eagles, coyotes, backyard wildlife. And today we have Chris Loscalzo, who is the president, correct, of Connecticut Ornithological Association. And you were with the New Haven, or still with the New Haven Bird Club, and I'm sure many other interests as they relate to our ducks that you can find here primarily in the winter, I guess, is what we're going to be talking about today. So with that, I'm going to one last thing. If you have any questions, please just post them at any time and we'll do them all at the end. And then if you have a question at the end, you can put that up as well. So with that, Chris, I'm going to hand it over to you and you can take it from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Russ, and welcome everybody. Looking to see how many people we have on board already, and I'm sure some more people will be signing on. So this is a talk that should take, I think, between 45 minutes and an hour. Plenty of time at the end for questions, and any question is welcome, from the most basic to the more complex. And it should be hopefully informative and fun for everybody. We're going to talk about the sea ducks of Long Island Sound, the birds that we can see from the shores of Hammonasset in winter is basically what we're going to be talking about. We're going to go from some of the more common species to some of the rare species. And this talk should hopefully be of interest to people who know a lot about birds already, but also be of great interest to people who just have a sort of a preliminary understanding or familiarity with the birds in our area. So I'm going to try to go to full screen here and give you guys a better look at the birds that we're going to be talking about. There's about 25 to 30 slides in total. So just to give you a kind of a perspective, this is a flock of birds that you can see out there. We're going to learn about these species. You might notice that there's a couple of birds that look different. We've got these birds right here that have the white foreheads and the colorful bills. And then right next to this one is a browner bird. And then right in the middle is a very striking white and black bird with a long tail. So we're going to learn all about those birds and quite a few other species in the next hour or so. Before we get into the birds themselves, a little moment to talk about what sea ducks actually are. And I will have to confess that we have a bit of a misnomer in terms of just referring to these different kind of birds as ducks. Only some of these birds are ducks, specifically the eider, scoter, scaup, goldeneye, mergansers, and a few other species that I'm going to be talking about are actually ducks. Loons, grebes, and cormorants, and alcids are other groups of birds, which technically aren't ducks, but they're still out there on Long Island Sound in the winter. So it's good to learn about them, get to know them. And so these are the different sort of categories of birds that we're going to talk about today. Loons, grebes, cormorants, eider, scoter, scaup, goldeneye, mergansers, alcids, and a couple of others. And in each case, there's about 2 or 3 species in each group that we'll be talking about. So it's a lot to go over. If you're not familiar with these different kinds of birds at all, then I would encourage you to just try to get to know what loons are like versus grebes versus cormorants. You don't have to memorize everything I'll be saying about the differences between the species within the groups. First go around, it might just be really useful to kind of get a sense of what these different groups are like. So without further ado, I will get started. The first bird is the common loon. well named. It is common throughout the US. And along our coast, it can be found. This is, in the winter, starting in about October, they'll arrive and they'll leave in the spring. And they will be found along the coast. This breeding plumaged bird here is what they look like in the summer. And that's when they'll be found up on lakes in mostly northern New England and all through Canada, northern US. There is one breeding pair in northern Connecticut that we know of that's been breeding in a particular lake in northern Connecticut for the last several years successfully. We've seen the young. It's very exciting. But this is what we get used. We're more used to seeing loons looking like this because this is what they look like in the winter. Brown backed, brown on the back of the neck, and a kind of a white face and a big thick bill. And one of the really good identifying characteristics for a common loon is this squared off head shape, very distinctive, pretty unusual in birds. Hopefully you can appreciate that, how it's kind of squared off. A little less prominent squaring off in the breeding plumage picture, but that's what you'll often see. In the spring, we'll see them get darker and darker. They transition to their breeding plumage before they head north. And as many people know, loons make some pretty cool sounds, and I'm going to play a couple. Here's the tremolo call. Rather famous sound that a lot of people associate with the natural areas in the far north. They also make some other calls, more plaintive and haunting. And still more. These are all calls that you can hear loons make. Sometimes they do make them here in the spring before they head north, and other times, you'll have to see them up on the breeding grounds to hear those sounds. But the common loon, it's a big bird, 9 pounds, really big, bulky bird, and you get to appreciate that when you see them there out in the water. Sometimes they're right in close, right along the Meigs Point jetty. So you can see them well, even with the naked eye. A pair of binoculars will give you lots of good detail. And then a spotting scope is even better for seeing the birds that are further out away from shore. The other loon that you will often find in the Connecticut waters in the winter is a bird called the red-throated loon. The name seems odd because when we see them, they look like this picture in the middle with the white neck, little gray on the cap, and a kind of a speckled back, thinner bill than the common loon. But they get their name based on what they look like in the breeding plumage in the summer. And you can see they have this bright reddish throat stripe right down their throat. We in Connecticut don't usually get to see birds looking like this. They nest way up north in the Arctic. So when we do see them in winter, it's fun to think about how far they have to go to get back to their breeding grounds. I've had the good fortune to see birds look like this just a couple of times here in Connecticut. Once in the very early fall, a bird that must have just arrived from its breeding grounds and had not yet gone out of its breeding plumage, molted out. But it really is quite striking. Anyway, they're smaller and thinner than the common loon. They're only about 3 pounds, which is quite the dramatic difference. When you see them in the water, maybe they look about half or 2/3 as big as a common loon. In flight, they're more slender and have more white in the neck compared to the common loon. But this is a fairly common species that you have a good chance of seeing. And so when you see a loon, you want to try to help yourself figure out, if you can, between whether it's a red-throated loon or the common loon. Again, common loon, bigger, bulkier, blocky head, rounder head in the red-throated loon, more white on the neck, slimmer bill are the best ways to differentiate between those. Then there's a rarity that shows up. It's the Pacific loon. So of course it's much more common out in the Pacific Ocean rather than the Atlantic. About once every 3 to 5 years, I'd say, a Pacific loon will show up along the Connecticut coast. To me, they look like a bit of a cross, winter plumage anyway, a bit of a cross between the common loon and the red-throated loon. They're about the size of the red-throated loon, but they have a lot more dark on the neck, more dark on the head, less white. The bill is about the same size as the red-throat. They have a darker back than the red-throated loon. This is what they look like in breeding plumage, quite striking, with the striping on their necks and on their back. Again, I've had the good fortune to see that a few times as well. But these are real rarity. This is a real rarity, and it's not easy to find in Connecticut. One word of caution is that juvenile or young red-throated loons have more dark on their neck and can look like a Pacific loon. So sometimes we have people saying, hey, I think I'm seeing a Pacific loon, when in reality it's a juvenile red-throated loon. These are truly rare. Moving on to the grebes. This is our common grebe that's in the sound in the winter. It's called the horned grebe. They're tiny. They're only 14 inches long from tip of the bill to the tip of the tail. And they only weigh about a pound. They have a nice bright white cheek patch and a black cap. They have a small bill, kind of grayish back, a little mottling on the side, light neck. This is them in winter plumage. They're non-breeding plumage. They look very different in the breeding plumage, very dark. And in the spring, they do transition into the breeding plumage so that they can be a little bit confusing. They tend to fly with their heads held high, which is kind of cute. And they have some white in the wing as well. Also, the other thing that's of note is that they will often move around in small groups. I've sometimes seen even 10, 20, 30 birds together. So some of these other birds that I've been talking about tend to be more solitary. But one of the distinctive things about horned grebes is that they are often found in small groups. A less common grebe in our waters in the winter is the red neck grebe. Similarly, in breeding plumage, they have a lot of red in their neck. This is what they look like in non-breeding plumage. They're bigger than the horned grebe. They have a darker neck. They have a little bit of white on the back of the cheek. They have a fairly prominent dark cap that extends down over the face. A large orange bill and a dark back. So this is the redneck grebe. It's pretty uncommon. You're lucky to see one. They are along the coast every winter, but they are not a common bird. Tend to be a little more common the further east you go. But if you do see one, you'll notice the orange bill right away, dark head, bigger, bulkier bird than the horned grebe. Will often be mistaken for a loon, actually, but once you zero in on these details, then you can make a proper, correct identification. This is another rarity. Just like the loons, we had two fairly common loons and then one really rare loon. We have two grebes that we can find on a fairly regular basis, and this one is sort of a Western counterpart of the horned grebe called the eared grebe. Darker neck than the horned grebe, has a pointy crest, if you will, right over the eye, which is a good identifying mark. This is what they look like in breeding plumage over here on the left. Since you can see why they're called eared grebes, they have this sort of orange patch that, over their ears, if you will, and very distinctive, very brightly colored. And they're out west. If you go to Colorado or Wyoming in the summer, you will see eared grebes if you look on small ponds and lakes. The picture on the right shows a horned grebe next to an eared grebe, which is convenient. The horned grebe, which is our common small grebe in the winter, has that nice bright white cheek patch, the dark cap, whereas the eared grebe has a more slender neck, darker neck overall, darker cap, less white on the face. And again, a little bit of a pointy crest over the eye is a way to try to differentiate the two. Eared grebes are pretty rare. Again, maybe one a winter will show up at most somewhere along the coast. I think there might have been some late arrivals, so I'm just going to scroll back very briefly to mention that we started off talking about common loons, which are just that. They're big, bulky birds with blocky heads. Red-throated loons, which are more slender and have more white on the neck and a thinner bill than the common loon. Pacific loon, which is a real rarity, but beautiful when you get to see it. Our horned grebe, which is our common little grebe that's in the ocean in the winter. Redneck grebe, less common, and then the eared grebe, quite rare. Our next kind of group of birds that we're going to talk about are the cormorants. And we have two cormorants in Connecticut. One is a winter visitor, and that's the one I'm showing here. It's the great cormorant. They are big. They're called great for a reason, meaning great in size. And they are big birds, 7 pounds, so they're almost as big and heavy as the common loon. They're very dark birds, mostly black as adults. Their face will have a bit of orange at the base of the bill and some white, which you can see here quite well. Some of them will actually also show a white patch in their flank areas, which is visible in flight, and that's quite distinctive to the great cormorant. Big, bulky birds. They often roost on jetties, breakwaters, poles that are out there, buoys and such. You'll see the great cormorants, sunning themselves and drying themselves on the rocks. They swim and dive for fish. This is what a juvenile great cormorant looks like. And in the winter, you'll see a variety of adults or a mixture of adults and juveniles. The immature, I shouldn't call it juvenile, it's really immature bird is the more correct way to refer to them. They have white bellies and dark necks, which is good to keep track of. Dark neck, white belly, great cormorant. I will also mention that loons, grebes, and cormorants all dive for fish. That's what they feed on for the most part. And again, all these wintering ducks that are out in the Long Island Sound dive for their food. And that is in contrast to what we call dabbling ducks, which tend to just tip over and leave their rear end sticking up when they feed. They're feeding on shallow or feeding on plant life in shallow waters. Behind me, you might be able to see, actually, I have a beautiful print of a duck that's in the Sound. Actually, this is a long-tailed duck. We'll be talking about them in a minute. And over my other shoulder in the distance are some teal that are dropping down into a little pond. Those are examples of dabbling ducks. Anyway, back to the cormorants. So this is the great cormorant, and they'll occasionally be out on Meigs Point Jetty. They'll often be out on the breakwater a little further to the east and a little farther out. You'll see them flying out over the water as they go from one feeding area to another. Look for the white cheek patch, big size. Look for the white in the flank, big black bird. Another thing about cormorants, they'll often flap and glide as they fly. That's a good thing to kind of pick up on. And these are the birds that are here from fall till spring. I'm also going to be mentioning the double-crested cormorant, even though this is really, it doesn't fit the pattern of these wintering ducks in the sense that this bird is much more common in the summer, and it does breed along the coast of Connecticut. There's one spot in particular in Madison called Tuxas Island, where there's a nice colony of these birds. You can see their nests, all year round in the trees there. They nest in the trees and on the ground. They make stick nests. So this is the double-crested cormorant. This is the cormorant that you're more likely to see over the course of the year. It's here from the spring, April through November. A few will linger through the winter, so there are a couple around December through March. And they will be along the coast, but they'll also be in inland ponds and lakes and reservoirs and in rivers. They don't have any white in the face, and they don't have any white flanks. They have just orange in the face. And the juveniles, or again, the immatures, have the reverse pattern to the great cormorant. Remember, the great cormorant had a dark neck and a light belly. The double-crested cormorant, immature bird, has a light neck and a dark belly. Very convenient of them to differentiate themselves that way. The double-crested cormorant is smaller than the great cormorant, probably about 2/3 the size. When you see them side by side, you can definitely tell that there's a big bird and a smaller bird. Some people get mixed up about that when there's two different species that are similar in appearance, and one's bigger and the other's a little smaller. Sometimes people think, oh, that must be a juvenile next to the bigger bird. But that's not usually the case. Once a bird's out of the nest, they're usually full size. So when you see a bigger bird and then a similar looking smaller bird, you're probably seeing two different, away from nests, you're probably seeing two different species. Good example of that are the egrets that we have in Connecticut. We have a great egret and a snowy egret. They're both big, white, long-necked birds. Great egret, it's about twice the size of a snowy egret. So when you see them next to each other, you think, oh, maybe an adult and a juvenile, but no, they're different species. Same idea here with the cormorants. The double-crested cormorant is a smaller bird. You can see them in flocks, sometimes very large flocks, especially during migration. These are some juveniles that show the fact that the light on the neck can vary in terms of how much there is. Sometimes there's a little bit, sometimes there's a lot, but they're always lighter above and darker below as an immature bird. It takes them a good full year, I think, to molt into a mature plumage. So for the full first year, even perhaps even longer, you'll see them in immature plumage. All right, so those are our two cormorants. I'm going to move on now. We're finally entering into the true duck species. Again, loons, grebes, and cormorants technically aren't ducks. They are waterfowl. That's the better term to use for them. But we know what you mean if you say, hey, I'm seeing a sea duck or a wintering waterfowl or whatever. Anyway, so common eider is an interesting story. These are beautiful birds. They are our largest duck. The males, here's an adult male, quite striking. Most water birds tend to have dark on top and light below. Well, the male common eider is the opposite. They're white on top and dark below. Here you can see in flight, they have black bellies, but white on top. White backs, white chest, white cheek patch. They have a black cap, some green on the back of the neck, and a little bit of green into their gray bill. Very, very big, striking bird, beautiful. This is what the male looks like when it's just a year old or so, or 6 months to a year old. They're more brown with some white on the back and some white on the chest. And this is a female, usually pretty brown, mottled brown, sort of striped, long, tapering gray bill, light face with a little bit of a light eye line above the eye. Here's a pair of them in flight. There are different races. There's one race that's more gray than brown, but you don't have to get into that. But they have this wedge-shaped head, as it says, long gray bill, very distinctive. And some of the interesting things about eiders is, there's so many interesting things. One is that they've become much more common along our Connecticut coast in the last few years, especially this winter. So if you dial back 10 to 20 years ago, it was pretty hard to see eiders except the most eastern extreme of our Connecticut coast in winter. So sort of out in the New London area, Mystic, Stonington is where you'd see eiders. And it'd be pretty hard to find them in let's say, Middlesex, New Haven, Fairfield counties. That's not true this winter. They're all along the coast in decent numbers. Unfortunately, the hunters figured that out as well. So I was out in the Stonington and Mystic area a week or two ago, and there were plenty of duck hunters out there taking their share of eiders. But there's plenty of them to go around. They are a pretty common bird, and they can be found along the coast. And the further north you go, the more abundant they tend to become. So the Maine coast and Massachusetts coasts, you'll see hundreds of eider together. Here we'll see, single birds, small groups, maybe a couple dozen in certain areas. Hammonasset usually has at least a few. And you'll see any of these birds, either the adult, the young male, or a female. They can come in close to shore, so you can get good looks at them. They're often along the jetty or out by the end of the moraine trail is a good place to look for them, feeding near those rocks at the end of the moraine trail. One of the interesting things about them is that they dive for their food, and they often will feed on crabs and clams and things like that. But I'll also often see them come up from underwater. They'll come up to the surface and they'll have a crab in their mouth. The gulls, great black-backed and herring gulls, have figured out that could be a good source of food. So you will not uncommonly see a gull hanging around where eiders are feeding, and when a eider pops up with a crab, the gull will try to get it to drop it and take it away as food for itself. I've seen the instances where eiders will come up 9 or 10 times in a row with a crab, only to lose it to a gull and then go back down, get another one, and before it finally gets one for itself. But that's not typical. The more commonplace occurrences for them to get their food and get to eat it and not have to give it up. That's a common eider, and it's a truly beautiful large waterfowl that we can see from mid-fall to mid-spring and through winter. There's a rare eider called the king eider. I would say one shows up on the Connecticut coast about every 5 years or so. Again, the further east you go, the more likely you are to see it. Rhode Island coast is a good place to find a king eider. Just about every winter, you'll find at least one. And as you go further north, you're more likely to see them. The males are extraordinary when you get to see an adult male. They have this baby bluish teal or slate gray, bluish gray cap and nape, a little bit of green in there. There's bright orange, showy bill with the extension up above the bill, light cheek, white neck, black body, a little bit of white in here. You just will never mistake it. If you get to see it, well, you'll know right away that this is something quite unique. And this is called the king eider. This is the first winter male, pretty much all brown, in contrast to the first winter common eider, which has some white in the chest and back. The first winter king eider, generally almost all brown, has a less sloped orange bill as opposed to the gray bill of the common eider. And in the female, it has a black bill, smaller bird compared to the female common eider, stockier, shorter, stocky neck, rounder head, less sloped. A little bit tricky ID. The bill color helps, the size helps, some of the modeling differences in the modeling helps. But any female eider that looks small compared to the others around it, you'll want to zero in on the bill color if you're hoping to see a female king eider. So those are the two eiders. And again, we're now into the true sea ducks. I'm now going to talk about the three scoters that can be found along the Connecticut coast in winter. All of them on very, very rare occasion can be found as a non-breeding bird during the summer months. That's kind of an oddity. These birds tend to arrive in the fall and leave in the spring, and they're here through the winter, and they're out in the sound. The surf scoter is the most common of the three that we'll see. And once again, the male is quite distinctive in its plumage characteristics and in its bill shape and coloration. This is the male surf scoter right here. The white on the back of the neck, the nape of the neck, is very distinctive. So if it's facing away from you, you'll see this bright white patch, strikingly white in contrast to the black of the head and back and everything. Has a white forehead as well. So you can also see white when it's facing you. And it has this multicolored thick bill, black face, light eye, black body. It's what they look like in flight. Big black bird, bulky bird in flight, and with the white on the neck and in the face. No white in the wing. This is a female adult surf scoter with a couple of little white patches on the face, a bit of a dark cap, rather large sort of sloping bill. So a little bit of white on the face, dark cap, browner bird than the male. If you remember that very first slide I showed when we were starting, if you got to see that, there were male and female surf scoters side by side. We'll go back to that later, perhaps. This is our most common scoter in the winter along the coast, and they are the scoter most likely to be seen at Hammonasset, along the jetty at the end of the marine trail is a very good place to see them. They're sometimes close to shore. Often they're a little further out. So like with the naked eye, you'll just see a group of black or dark birds. And with binoculars, you can start picking out the birds with the white, on the head for the males. With a scope, you'll see them with good detail. The other scoter, well, there's two more. The second scoter to talk about is the black scoter. The male is all black except for this really prominent orange knob at the base of the bill, really quite distinctive. And they're otherwise all black. The females are dark brown with a very dark cap and then a light cheek patch. And the contrast between the dark cap and the light cheek patch is quite distinctive. They are often seen in pairs, and here's a pair of them in flight. And they actually make a really interesting plaintive call, which I'm going to play for you in just a moment. Here we are. Hopefully you could hear that all right. It's a real plaintive whistle. And what's really neat is if there's a large group of black scoters together, that just gets magnified and it really gets to be quite loud and very distinctive and very, very haunting and interesting to hear. I think they get more vocal as the year goes along. So in the spring, you're more likely to hear them. I think as they're starting to interact and prepare for the breeding season, but I'm not completely sure about what the whole purpose of the vocalization is, but it is quite distinctive and quite interesting to hear, and always a pleasure to hear. I'm going to play it one more time. And this is the black scoter call, if you will, as they communicate. If you listen carefully, you can hear the sound of the surf in the background. They don't mind the waves. So that's the second of the three scoters. Here's the third scoter, perhaps the most easy to identify of the three, because they very conveniently have these nice bright white wing patches that you can see very well in flight, but you can also see a stripe of white on their bodies when they're in the water. This is the male white-winged scoter. They're a big bird. They're even a little bigger than the other two scoters. The adult males have this white comma on their face, which when you get to see that, it's really distinctive. It's like a little stripe that curls around the eye, so it's in the shape of a comma. They have a pretty prominent, long, sloping bill. Again, a big bird with this white patch that, fortunately, is usually quite visible when they're in the water. And then again, in flight, you get to see it quite well. It really flashes at you when they're flying. The females, even though you don't see the white patch very well in this picture of the female, their white patch is just as large as the male's white patch. And you can usually see that stripe here. And in flight, you'll see a bright white patch. Similar to the black scoter female, they have white patches on their face. Little different in the sense that their head's more uniformly brown. Otherwise, the black scoter female had more of a, I'm going to go back to it real quick, more of a dark cap and then a lighter cheek with the white patches. To me, the surf scoter female is sort of a blend between the black scoter female and the white-winged scoter female. But anyway, if you see a brown duck with white patches on the face, you'll be thinking either surf scoter or white-winged scoter. Just to complicate things more, I don't have pictures of harlequin ducks. Female harlequin ducks have some patches on their face as well. At any rate, this is the white-winged scoter, the male and female together. They're perhaps the least common. It's kind of tricky. The black and the white-winged scoters are definitely less common than the surf scoters, but it kind of depends on where you are as to whether or not you're more likely to see black scoter versus white-winged scoter. But these are generally the less common species compared to the surf. Here's the one that I have behind me, the long-tailed duck, gorgeous bird. This can be a spark bird for certain people. That refers to this bird that a person sees that really turns them on to birds, gets them excited about bird watching because they just see something so striking and beautiful. They say, oh my goodness, really nature's amazing. And our long-tailed ducks come in November and leave in April. They nest pretty far north. Almost all of these birds that I've been talking about, the only exception was the double-crested cormorant that breeds here, but all the other ones nest pretty far north. And a lot of them breed in the Arctic tundra, in lakes and ponds. Some of them breed in lakes in the more of the boreal forest, which is kind of interesting. And some of these birds I'm talking about today, especially a little later on, actually nest in tree cavities, which is always kind of interesting to kind of envision this bird that's so acclimated to being in water as being able to go up into a tree and go into a hole and nest there. At any rate, the long-tailed duck, really striking, well named. The males have these really long tails. Hopefully you can see that. Goes from here all the way out to there. Long dark tail feathers. Here it is in flight. You can see that trailing tail feather. The males in the winter are this striking white and black pattern, a little gray on the face, but really white on the top of the head is very distinctive. You don't get to see that in almost any other waterfowl. White on the back, white on the sides. And this is the female. They have a much shorter tail. They have a dark patch on an otherwise white face and neck, a little dark on the top of the head, dark backs, white on the chest and sides. You'll see them in small groups, larger flocks, individual birds. They're fairly common along our coast and often don't associate much with other birds. Sometimes they just happen to be feeding with others, but they tend to stay within themselves. So you'll see, flocks of long-tailed ducks on their own. In breeding plumage, both male and females get darker, almost completely black. They have some white still in certain spots, but they both get very dark. And I suspect that's to be better for camouflage on their breeding grounds. But in the winter, they're quite showy and have this distinctive white and black contrast. Quite the beautiful bird. And again, behind me, you can see a beautiful picture of a male in very icy water taken off our coast a couple of winters ago. Okay, the next bird I'm going to talk about is scaup. There's two species of scaup. One of them is the greater scaup. I will forewarn you that the greater and lesser scaups are very hard to tell apart. And sometimes you just have to say, hey, I see a scaup, but I'm not sure which species it is. We refer to that as scaup, species, which is fine. At any rate, both scaups come in winter. The greater scaup is the one that likes salt water. And so you will often find them out in the sound. They often form these things we call rafts, which are these long, thin flocks in the water. They just line up. They don't form a round flock. They're a long sort of flock with just a few birds next to each other, but you might see 100 or 200 in this long line of birds. So how do you identify a greater scaup? Well, they have a really large, round, dark head, a light colored eye, a black chest, white flanks, sort of darker on the back, dark in the rear here. And the round head is fairly distinctive, contrasting it from the lesser, which you'll see in a minute. The females are all brown, darker brown head and chest, lighter brown back and sides, but a very distinctive white patch at the base of their bill, which you can see quite well, especially when they're kind of facing you. And they have kind of a bluish bill. The greater scaup have a lot of white in their wings. It's somewhat variable. I don't find that to be a particularly helpful field mark, but at least theoretically, they have more white in the wings than the lesser scaup. The lesser scaup, in contrast, by the way, the green versus purple head coloration is not always reliable. It depends a little bit on how it reflects the sunlight. So if you see a bright green head, you could be thinking greater scaup, but greater scaups can look purplish in their heads, and lesser scaups are often looking purple in the head, but they can sometimes have a greenish hue to them as well. But this is the lesser scaup. They're much less common out in the ocean or sound. They prefer bays, harbors, even freshwater ponds and lakes. So if you see a scaup inland in a pond or a lake, you can be thinking lesser scaup. If you see a big flock of scaup out in the ocean, you're probably looking at greater scaup. The females likewise have white at the base of the bill. Here's a greater scaup and lesser scaup together. The lesser scaup, when they're awake and alert, will have a bit of a tuft or peak to their head feathers towards the back of the head. Birds here. Not a super great ID, but it's one of the better ones to try to differentiate greater and lesser scaup. So it's fairly subtle, but you can see that this is a very round head that kind of slopes down. This one a little less round with a little bit of a point. Lesser scaup males tend to have a little more barring on their backs than the greater scaup. They're also about 10% smaller, so if you see them next to each other, you will potentially pick up on the size difference. But that's a real tough ID. Again, if you're out along the coast, out the Meigs Point jetty, and you see a flock of 20, 30, 50, 100 birds that look like scaup, again, the males will look like this, females like this, you can be pretty confident that most, if not all of them, are greater scaup. All right, here's greater scaup, lesser scaup. Now on to the goldeneye. We have two goldeneye to talk about. Here's our common one, well named. They're beautiful birds. These are members of, they are ducks. And they're here in our coastal waters from November to April, rarely any other time. They can be found on inland lakes and reservoirs, usually in small numbers. The larger concentrations of them will be out on the coast in the sound. And the males have this sort of funny shaped head, not perfectly round, call it pear-shaped or something like that, and have this nice oval white patch on their face between their golden eye and their dark bill. Their bodies are white, their chest and sides are white, black on the back, black towards the back of the body. And so this is what the male looks like. The female looks quite similar, but has a brown head instead of the green head and is lacking the white oval patch on its face. They're often seen together. Here's all three males here in flight. I don't have a female in flight, sorry, but at any rate, here's the male, here's the female, and they are common. You'll see good numbers of them. You can see them alone, in pairs, in small groups. You can see them by the dozens on occasion in flocks just off the shore. A very pretty bird and pretty distinctive looking. Now there is a rare Western counterpart called the Barrow's goldeneye. And one of them or more might turn up along the coast each winter, especially when you're out looking for them, you can find them. They do interbreed on occasion, and you can sometimes find a confusing bird that is actually a hybrid between the common and the Barrow's goldeneye. But usually you can find either a pure male or female Barrow's goldeneye. The male is pretty distinctive with more of a kind of a crescent shaped spot on its face. The head shape is a little different, a little longer. And then this pattern here is very distinctive. They have this, we refer to it as a black spur down the side along the sort of shoulder area that goes right down like to the water here. And then has this black and white sort of checkered pattern along the back. I'll go back to the common goldeneye. It doesn't really have that at all. Does not have the black spur, doesn't have that prominent black and white checkered pattern that the male Barrow's goldeneye has. Still white on the chest and white on the side here. But when I see a bird, a male goldeneye, and I want to figure out whether it's a common or a Barrow's, I look at that facial patch. Is it oval or is it crescent shaped? And I look here at the back, sort of the back over the shoulder area, and this, look for the spur. Once you zero in on that, it's pretty easy to pick out a Barrow's goldeneye male pretty quickly. Female, it's a little more complicated. It's really the bill color that's the difference. The female Barrow's goldeneye has a pretty much all orange bill. That's pretty reliable. Whereas the female common goldeneye has a black bill with a light tip. So if you see a female goldeneye and you're trying to figure out whether it's a common or a Barrow's, you zero in on the bill. That's the best way. So those are the two goldeneye. Again, the common, which we are likely to see, the Barrow's, which is a rarity, which you're fortunate to find when you can find one. Here's another species of duck that's amongst the favorites of many. It's called the bufflehead, which is a great name to begin with. And they're small ducks, and they're really very pretty and very striking. Here's the male with this big white patch on its head, greenish purplish sort of forehead and lower part of the head around to the lower nape, black back, white sides, white chest, very marked contrast in the male. Here's the male in flight. But this is very easy to pick out. The white on the head and the white on the body and the black really contrasts. Here's the female, has this interesting sort of straight white patch on the face. It's never round. It's always kind of a horizontal line that extends further left to right than top to bottom. Dark cap, dark head, otherwise dark back, grayish body. Can't really tell it too well, but they do have pink feet, which are very brightly, colored and were quite comical looking when you can see them out of the water. All of these birds will occasionally get out of the water and sit on rocks and such. These are like bathtub toys. They, dive for food and then they pop back up on the surface. And, you'll just can't help but think of like a little bathtub toy sitting on the top of the water in the tub. Which actually brings up an interesting kind of topic of discussion, is to think about what these birds, they're lightweight because, they have hollow bones and are made of feathers. They often weigh only a pound or two. And they have to dive down, despite their light weight, they dive down into the water and feed. And then I think it's probably pretty easy for them to come back up to the surface, because once they stop sort of diving and propelling themselves downward, they'll come right back up to the surface. Anyway, buffleheads are really quite adorable, cute, and colorful, and easy to identify. Just a few more species of ducks, and then we're going to finish up talking about alcids, which are an interesting group of birds. Here's the red-breasted merganser. There are 3 merganser species, but really only one of them. This one is the one that can be found in the Sound. The other 2 tend to prefer freshwater or brackish water. The other two species, just so you've heard the names, are common and hooded merganser. But again, they're more likely to be seen in rivers, ponds, and lakes. But the red-breasted merganser is the one that you're going to find out off the shore of Hammonasset. Fairly common, so you're likely to see them if you go for a walk along the marine trail. Somewhere along the trail or out by the end of the trail or maybe by the jetty, you will find red-breasted mergansers. Once again, we have contrasting plumage between the male and the female. Here's the male with a green head, a long, straight orange bill, and a white neck, dark chest, dark back, gray body. And what's really distinctive about them is these wispy feathers that stick out the back of their head. It's not a single crest like you might find on a cardinal or a blue jay, but wispy feathers that come up back here and down here. So it's kind of a bad hair day type thing where the feathers are kind of sticking out in all different directions. Females will have that as well, a little less prominent, but you can usually pick out these sort of straggling feathers that stick out sort of beyond the head towards the back. Females have more of an orangish coloration to their neck and head, but still have the orange bill that the adult male has. More uniformly gray body, light neck. And again, this is the merganser species that you'll find in the Sound typically. Their long bills are well made for catching fish. So they'll dive for fish in the water and grab them with their long bills. Here's a group of them in flight. They have a lot of white in the wing, long necked, long bill. They give you kind of a long look when they fly. But that's the red-breasted merganser. Now we're on to the alcids, which is how we're going to finish up. Then I'll take questions from anyone who has any questions about what we've gone over. Alcids are a group of birds that are out in the ocean. They're really more what we call pelagic birds. They're usually out in the ocean and only occasionally come into the Sound. This particular winter has been a very good winter for alcids as a group. This bird here, the razorbill, is by far the most common alcid that's found in the Sound in the winter. Sometimes, often they're way out in the Sound. Occasionally will come closer to shore. And again, of the group of them, the razorbill is the one most likely to be seen. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time about differentiating between the alcids. I'm just going to kind of run through them fairly quickly. They are all referred to, when you see them in flight, as footballs with wings. They have these football-shaped bodies, sort of short, stocky necks tapering down to their head and bill, and kind of a tapering out to their rather short tail. And there's fairly narrow wings that they flap fairly quickly. And so again, they look like a football with wings when they're in flight. They dive, they spend a lot of time underwater. They'll go down and come back up 100 yards from where they went down. So they're a little hard to track when you're looking for them, in the water. If you see one and then it drops down, you may not see it again. But this is the razorbill. It has a thick bill, dark cap, lighter cheek, white here, little white line there. Here they are in flight. There's two species of murre that can be found. They are rare. This one's the common murre. Again, if you go up to Massachusetts or Nova Scotia or something, you'll find these in abundance. People eat these things, but in the winter, I guess they're edible. But anyway, this is the common murre. This is what they look like in non-breeding plumage. In breeding plumage, they're a lot darker. They have a lot of white on the face. They have a little black stripe down along the neck, white here, and brownish upper parts. The other murre is called the thick-billed murre. It does have a thicker bill than the common murre. Has a lot more dark on the face and neck, even in winter, and black back, white sides, more of a contrast than the common murre. Here's what's referred to as the black guillemot. It's called black guillemot because this is it breeding plumage. It's almost all black with white in the wings, these white wing patches, which are quite distinctive. If you're really lucky, you'll see one of these in March, before they head north. This is what we'd more likely see in winter. They're mostly white, just a little bit darker back. There was one along the Connecticut coast, Rocky Neck State Park, a few weeks ago for about a week and a half. A lot of bird watchers went to see that bird. It's pretty rare though. One every 10 years maybe will show up along the Connecticut coast, especially after storms. They might get blown in. And then the very last bird of Alcids that we'll talk about very briefly here is the dovekie. It's a cute little bird. This is actually actual size. They're only about 7 inches long. So even though I have this picture blown up, they're short, stubby bill. They're like a miniature razor bill. Cute little things. And unfortunately, when you see one near the coast, it usually means it's injured or unwell, because otherwise they stay out in the ocean. Again, they can be blown in by storms. But a dovekie is a cute little alcid that you'll get to see sometimes, or at least on rare occasion. So I'm going to scroll all the way back to the beginning, and that's the end of my presentation, such as it is, and we'll open it up to questions. I think Russ will probably read them out. We'll see how this works. Thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope this has piqued your interest a little bit in birds and gives you a chance to identify what's off the Connecticut coast, particularly off our shores of Hammonasset in late fall, winter, and into early spring. Thanks for joining in.
Thanks, Chris. And we do have lots of questions coming in on Facebook. So
Okay.
again, if anybody has any questions, you can post them on Facebook or in the comment section, and we'll try and go through a few of them now. A lot of questions about hunting of ducks, why people hunt them, what they do with them, that sort of thing. So you want to address that a little bit. I know that's sometimes
That's a sensitive topic. It's a tough one in a way. I won't claim to be an expert. Obviously, hunting is a long-standing tradition in our country with a sort of a mixed heritage. There are people who hunt waterfowl for sustenance, and we'll make them meals. There are quotas, pretty strict quotas about how many birds hunters are allowed to collect in any season. And my understanding is that waterfowl hunters are generally pretty responsible people, and they will stick to those quotas. It is a tricky subject, though. As a bird watcher, I'm certainly not a fan of hunting, especially when it's done just for sport. It's one thing if they're going to put it on the kitchen table and make it a meal. It's another thing if they're just killing it for the sake of shooting something that's moving and and then just disposing of the body or whatever. And these bird populations are in peril. Many bird species that we're familiar with, their numbers are in decline. And so for a lot of reasons, global warming, climate change is a big factor. Loss of habitat, loss of food sources throughout the year, including in their wintering grounds, perils during migration, all kinds of things are impacting species populations. And certainly when a species is in trouble, they should be taken off the list of birds that can be hunted. And we do see that. That's what Endangered Species Acts are all about. And obviously we hope that people will adhere to those rules and laws. So hopefully that does kind of address some of the questions people had about hunting. There is hunting in Connecticut. I think it's a little more prominent than people realize. I know from being out bird watching, I will encounter hunters either in marshes or out in the Sound, even on some lakes, and it can be a little disconcerting and it's frightening. And it's why people are encouraged to wear orange vests and caps and such if you're out anywhere where hunters might be. And so, but there is a somewhat limited hunting season in Connecticut. Again, I'm not totally up on exactly when the season is, but it is, they are out there. They're out there some the edges of marshes, and there will be hunting the waterfowl that we're talking about. I'm going to actually, before I take my next question, I meant to early on to help distinguish between sort of these sea ducks versus another kind of duck called the dabbling duck, or the pond ducks. I mentioned it briefly, but sea ducks dive for their food, whereas dabbling ducks just bend over, tip over, and feed from the surface. Those birds are hunted as well. All right, so perhaps next question.
Yeah, can I just chime in a little bit? There is hunting off of Hammonasset. So within the park, you're not allowed to hunt. But if a duck hunter is out in a boat, they're allowed to. And we get a lot of questions about that. And again, this is a very sensitive issue because here at Hammonasset is a fantastic place for bird watching. And a few yards away, there could be a hunter in a boat shooting at the ducks that the people are looking for. But that is legal as long as they're not coming into the park itself. All right, so another question, where and when do eiders breed?
Okay, yeah, so they breed in the summer, let's say from May through August or so, and they breed along the coast, generally north of here. But we're pretty sure that there's been a few breeding pairs along the southeast coast of Connecticut these last few summers. They nest on these small rocky islands just offshore for the most part. And they are now being seen during the summer along the southeast coast, east of the Connecticut River, the Rhode Island border. But again, if you want to find the easier way to find breeding eider is to go further north. If you go up towards Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Maine, you'll find most of the islands out there will have breeding eider, again, from mid to late spring to early summer.
And how much do eiders weigh?
I can look that up. I don't know that off the top of my head. I would have to say probably 6 or 8 pounds.
I can say somebody did look it up, but I think it was a chat between two people, but 6 pounds.
There you go, 6 pounds.
Put up.
Yep, yeah, so they're a big duck, a big heavy duck compared to some of the small. You might remember I mentioned the common loon is 9 pounds, great cormorant 7 pounds, and so yeah, common eider 6 pounds. Probably I would guess the more average sized duck is maybe more like 3 or 4 pounds. So they're big birds.
And do you have any theories about why the common eider is becoming more common farther west?
Yes,
with climate change, you would think it would be going the other direction.
Right. So I do only have theories or thoughts. I don't have a definitive answer. It is a phenomenon that we've been observing over these last several years, and this winter in particular. There has to be food, so it's that there's a food source for them here, and so they are along our coast because they're finding crabs and other animals that they feed on. As far as I know, they don't feed on any plant life, so it's crabs and shellfish and clams and things. And maybe that's the population is actually doing well, and so we're seeing the population extend further south. But it could also be that their food source is lessening further north, and so the lack of food further north along the coast is driving them further south. And I haven't researched it to see what the numbers are like along the Massachusetts or Maine coast. But if their numbers are dropping, then that may be why we're finding them coming down here. There's less food for them up north, so they're venturing farther and farther along the coast to find food. I'll try to find that out, but that's an interesting question.
Yeah, it's funny. Your theories are very similar to the theories why ice seals are showing up more often in Long Island Sound. So probably related in some way as far as.
Right. It's either food is lacking further north, so they're coming further south, or the species is doing well, and so they're sort of expanding their range. We see both phenomena with birds of all kinds. We have a lot of, not so much the ducks right now, but lots of species of birds are advancing their ranges into Connecticut from further south. And they are doing, they're doing fairly well under those circumstances. But there are also a lot of birds that are showing up here that don't belong here. And often they're driven by a lack of food in their more natural environment.
Mm-hmm. Another question, do ducks mate for life?
Good question, interesting question. A quick answer is I don't think so, not for the most part. I suspect that they do. There's a lot of things that impact pair bonds, and certainly the longevity of these birds is not great. They may only live for a few years, so there may be a pair for a couple of years, but then one of them will be lost. And then the male or female, the surviving bird, will find a new mate. There's also the phenomenon that they will breed with birds from another pair, so to speak. So there's that going on. But they certainly do pair up at least for the breeding season, and will be as for the most part faithful for that breeding season, and will sometimes, I think, kind of stay together through the winter. Although with all the sort of jockeying that you see in the spring before they leave, and that is one of sort of the entertaining or interesting things to observe of these wintering seabirds, is that you'll see them, the males are posturing and gesturing, doing their sort of courtship rituals out in the water to try to find receptive females. So I do think there's a lot of sort of interchangeability from one year to the next.
And going back to the dabbling versus diving ducks, would widgeon and brant be dabbling or diving?
Okay, so widgeon, American widgeons are, and Eurasian widgeons are the two widgeons that we have. Those are dabbling ducks for sure. You'll see them on ponds and in marshy areas. They don't really dive. They will tip and feed. Sometimes actually, widgeons actually even feed without tipping. It's kind of interesting. They're really surface feeders. You'll see them just dropping their bills to the surface of the water and feeding on algae and stuff that's right on the surface. But they would be grouped in with the dabbling ducks. I didn't talk about brant because they're sort of part of the goose family, but they are related to ducks, and you will see them. That's sort of the one bird that you'll see along the coast fairly commonly that I didn't mention, but I could have. But brants are like miniature. They look a little bit like miniature Canada geese. They have less white on the cheek patch, on the cheek, so they're more dark. They're beautiful birds, and they're more of dabblers. Again, they don't dive for food. You'll see them feeding along the shore, and they're feeding on vegetation, often on rocks just under the surface of the water. So they don't quite dabble exactly, but I would lump them with the dabbling waterfowl.
Now, something that I learned, dabbling ducks tend to have their legs more towards the center of their body, so that when they tip up, their legs are actually closer to the water. And diving ducks, it's closer to the rear of the body for propulsion when they're underwater.
That's
Is that
exactly
true
right.
That's true for most of these?
Yes, I think that's a pretty consistent finding, that these diving ducks that I've been talking about, their legs are sort of positioned way towards the back, which helps them propel themselves through the water as they're diving. Whereas the dabbling ducks have their legs more centered under their bellies, a little more forward compared to the diving ducks. That creates a different situation. They don't need to propel themselves down through the water. So that's a evolutionary adaptation. Don't know which came first. Did diving ducks precede dabbling ducks and evolve that way, or the other way around? But they did sort of split out that way many years ago into that sort of two different kind of strategy of feeding.
Can you give just a general idea for lifespans of the different groups?
Ooh, I can't be super precise. I'd have to take a very educated guess. Generally, the larger the bird, the more long-lived they are. So, our common loons and the great cormorants, I wouldn't be surprised if they live on average, let's say 10 to 20 years. The smaller ducks might be more like 5 to 10 years. That would be a good reference range.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the bufflehead is only like 5 years.
Yeah.
Last time I looked that up. So.
Yep. Yeah. The smaller they are, generally the shorter lived they are. Of course. But yeah, that sounds about right. Oh, and I should mention, one of the ways we find out about the age of a bird is banding, which is kind of a cool thing, right? So people will band birds. Put these identifying bands on them. Often, when on the breeding grounds, they'll band a bird that's, recently hatched or fledged. And then if that bird, so obviously they'll mark the date and time that the bird was banded as a young bird, so they know how old it is. And then if that bird is found 5, 10, 15 years later, you know how old it is. And so that's one of the ways we learn how old, how long-lived these birds can be. Harder to tell, birds in the wild. You'll see these flocks returning every winter. It's hard to know, is it the same individual? I will say that brings up another interesting subject, which is the idea of wintering grounds and how faithful birds are to their wintering grounds, just like they are sort of faithful to their breeding grounds. A lot of people know that birds will return to the same site every spring or summer to breed in the same location they did the year before. And that's very true. A lot of birds are pretty darn faithful to their breeding grounds. But what's also quite interesting is that many birds are quite faithful to their wintering grounds. And some species really right even down to the same acre, a couple of acres of land from one winter to the next. And a lot of these wintering birds that we see that come back, or we see each winter off our shores, are coming back to the same place. We sort of know that a few different ways. Like, for example, a Barrow's goldeneye was coming to the Tuxas Island area there in Madison for 5 winters in a row. And it's a rare enough bird. When you see a male Barrow's goldeneye in the same spot winter after winter after winter, you'd be pretty darn sure it's the same individual that's coming. We birders also know of a gull that's been going to the Ninigret Wildlife Refuge every winter for the last 15 years at least, showing up at the exact same spot year after year after year. So that's one sort of indirect way of kind of figuring out the longevity of a bird. But the faithfulness to their wintering grounds is an interesting phenomenon and reminds us why it's so important to take care of our habitat, our area, year round. You might want to think about taking care of your backyard to make it hospitable to birds that are coming to nest in the spring. But you have birds coming to your backyard in the winter as well. And they may be coming to that same patch of area of land every winter. And so putting out a bird seed for them is one way, but also planting shrubs and trees that will have food for the birds in winter is a real nice thing to do. And you'll be rewarded by seeing the birds coming back year after year.
Another question someone had, which species have you noticed the most change in numbers and distribution?
Well, my birding goes back 50 years, believe it or not. And I've been in Connecticut for the last 30 years. So I'm not sure if the question applies just to wintering waterfowl or all species of birds in general. It's a tough question. It depends on how we want to hone it down. Just a few, let's see, of the waterfowl. Sadly, a lot of these waterfowl species are in decline. Not all of them. It's about sort of 50-50. About half the species, I'd say, have declined in numbers, and the other half have either stayed the same. The eider sticks out as the one that's increased in numbers along our coast in recent years, I'd say. The loons and grebes and all these other ones have either stayed about the same or tailed off a little bit. Amongst like land birds, there's been a few species that have really increased their abundance in Connecticut in the last couple of decades. Some well-known examples include the common raven and the black vulture, are a couple of big dark birds that you can see now quite commonly in Connecticut year-round that 20 years ago were very hard to find.
We still have lots of questions coming in.
Okay.
What do the inland ducks do in the when the lakes freeze, when the inland waterways freeze? What do they do?
Yep. Well, they will move to open water. So these dabbling ducks, that's when it really freezes up in the lakes. You'll see them come to rivers. You'll see them come to marshy areas, sort of brackish areas. So, for example, you'll see the widgeons and really all the dabbling ducks will come and feed where just beyond the frozen water line. You'll see them in marshes and even along the edges of the coast. You'll find them. Some of them will go a little further south, but usually the birds that are, let's say, in Connecticut lakes and reservoirs in the winter, like this time of year, they're not going to migrate any further south. They're going to just try to find open. So our larger rivers obviously stay open through the winter, even during like a cold snap like we have now, and the marshes and anything that's tidal will generally stay open. So they move to those areas and then wait for the warmer weather to strike again, to warm up. And as soon as the lakes and ponds open up, they'll go right back to their preferred habitat.
So if these bodies of water, if we have a prolonged cold and many bodies of water got more and more frozen, you're going to start to see lots more ducks in a smaller area. Does that
Potentially,
become an issue for food?
definitely, potentially, that's a stress. That these, dabbling ducks, generally rely on these freshwater habitats and the food that's there. And yes, if we have an unusually harsh winter and a prolonged cold snap where it's below freezing and our freshwater ponds and lakes and rivers freeze up, yes, you'll potentially see a larger concentration of these birds come down to the coast. And yeah, some of them could starve from lack of food. Unfortunately, I can't say I see that very often. I do sometimes see some ducks that seem to be pretty stressed during a prolonged cold snap, but they're pretty adaptable. And the food that they're eating, there's the vegetation tends to be there in pretty good abundance. They usually have enough food. They will eat grass. That's another thing that you'll sometimes, especially real wet grass. But another sort of corollary of this whole issue of the cold is snow cover. Our geese and ducks you'll see them out on big open expanses of lawns and golf courses and farmlands. And, if we get a foot of snow, like we're going to get snow this week, if that snow covers the ground and does it for a month, the ducks and geese that will feed on that grass will have to go into the marshes and try to find food there. They usually do pretty well, though. I don't think there's high mortality amongst our waterfowl in the winter.
How do the ducks locate the same exact spot every year?
Well, speaks to the whole question of this migration and how birds were the same spot year after year. Is it that they following the magnetic poles? Are they picking up visual cues? Seeing certain aspects of the terrain, the course of the coast and the rivers and mountains and all that. Sounds and smells can direct them. I think it's a combination of all of those things. That's another talk, or even like a whole, course in a graduate school, to learn about how birds, find their ways in migration to return. I think what's really fascinating is that they do it right from birth. The juvenile birds, the young birds, they don't generally migrate with their parents and follow them to learn where to go by following their parents. They migrate on their own and will find their wintering grounds just by their inherent instincts in terms of what's been sort of burned into their brains to help them navigate their way down to their breeding grounds and their wintering grounds. So it's a fascinating topic, and there's a lot of research going on to try to figure out how birds find their way in migration, both northward or southward, and how they accomplish that feat. Again, I think it's a combination of things we can't see easily, like following magnetic poles, to visual cues, following the stars at night, and again, terrain features that that they can utilize.
We'll do one more. I want to thank you,
Okay.
but we had an interesting comment/question. Someone this summer came across some people that were carrying baby mergansers from a reservoir area because they did not see the mother. What do you think the best way to handle something like this would be?
Ooh, yeah. So that's I want to say a tricky question, but the general rule is leave them alone. If you see, like, for example, that must be a reference, I would assume, to hooded mergansers, but we do have both hooded and common mergansers that nest in our Connecticut lakes and rivers and such. So if someone finds some young mergansers, the female is probably still around and is just hiding maybe somewhere with some other of its young. I would think the best thing to do is leave them alone. They're pretty independent right after birth. These mergansers are a species that nest in cavities in trees, and the young, as soon as they're old enough, they'll pop up out of the hole in the cavity, drop down to the ground and make it to the nearest water. It's very interesting. They don't all nest in cavities like right over water. Some of them do, but very often they're in the woods, a short distance from the water's edge, whether it be a river or a pond. And so once they hatch, they grow to a certain size. Very soon, within days, they're popping up out of the tree cavity, make their way to the water, generally, with the female. They're following the female. They get, what do you call them? On it, and then they'll be on their own. They're feeding on their own. They don't need to be fed. So these young, mergansers feed usually on aquatic vegetation on the surface, and they really need the female for protection. Is really what she's there for. And so if you find young mergansers or young wood ducks, for example, generally best to leave them alone and assume that they're going to be okay on their own, or that the female is around. I will say one other thing about it, which is that we've seen instances of a single female adult merganser have dozens of young following it. So that's one of the ways that, let's say, if young birds lose their mother at a young age, they'll find the next female further up the river or along the pond edge. There might be another female that's got its own young, and they'll just join in on that group. So I've seen some pictures of, merganser females with dozens of young birds trailing it.
I'm going to chime in on that and say, I get a lot of people that capture baby animals. I always say it's basically kidnapping baby animals. And then they say, well, we didn't see the parent. And my response is, you're not going to see the parent if you're chasing their babies around.
Right.
Or if you're in the area. So very often, your presence is what causes you not to see the adult. And somebody else chimed in about this being whether this is legal or not. And this is absolutely not legal for you to take them home, because the other part, and I don't think I mentioned this, was the person said that they were going to bring them home and raise them themselves.
Oof, terrible.
Which is completely illegal. They have to go to a rehabilitator, and you can call the DEEP hotline, which is 860-424-3333, and they will put you in contact with your rehabilitator. And if someone is planning on bringing them home, you can call that number, and they will send an NCON out to confiscate the animals and get them to the rehabbers. So definitely something that you should not be doing on your own or attempting in any way to raise any baby animals at home. Chris, I want to thank you.
It's a death sentence for the.
I want to thank you very much. A great presentation. I'm sure that I missed some questions. I'll have to go back and see. They were coming in pretty fast and furious there at the end. I think we had over 100 people watching on Facebook and almost 50 on Zoom. So great attendance. I want to let everybody know we do have a lot of other programs coming up on Saturdays at 10 o'clock. So make sure you go to meigspointnaturecenter.org, take a look at the calendar, and you can connect right to those Zoom links on those calendars. I also want to give a shout out to the Friends of Hammonasset who helped put on all of these programs. So thank you to the Friends, and thank you, Chris. Another great presentation. I think I've heard this a couple of times now, and I swear I learned something every single time you do it. So you want to come back next year?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sure I'd be happy to, of course.
All right.
All right. Thanks very much for having me. I hope everybody stays warm and gets to see some nice birds and waterfowl this winter. Hammonasset's a great place to see all kinds of wildlife. So thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
All right. Bye.